Just make sure that I put the right date in for.
Hey, well, good afternoon. It's great to see so many people out for a lunchtime talk on such a beautiful day. Thank you all for taking some time to join us. We're really excited about this talk. These map talks have been fantastic, and I'm happy to announce that Alla has promised she's going to continue them until you all stop showing up. And we have room to expand too, so make sure you tell your friends, even your enemies. It's okay. Bring them here. We like them all. So my name is Patrick Spear. I'm the executive director here. I see a lot of familiar faces, but I want to put a few things on your radar screens for other events that are happening here at the library in the coming days. So on Monday, June the 10th, we're busy here. We're having another lunch. This is a lunch at the library. Unlike these lunches where you bring your own, this lunch is provided by the Inn. You have to purchase a ticket in advance. And this is a book talk called Embracing Your Past to Empower Your Future. And it's a study of 4 families whose ancestors were enslaved. So it's a profile on them, their family history, and what you can learn by studying your past. And then we're having our next evening talk is the Martha Washington Lecture, which will be on June the 20th. And it's a co-authored book with Diana Carlin, Anita McBride, Nancy Keegan, and their book is Remember the First Ladies, The Legacies of America's History-Making Women. And I can assure you that one of the first ladies they're going to talk about is the first, Martha Washington herself, since we're here at Mount Vernon. So that's on June the 20th. And then on July the 1st, we're having another brown bag here. That'll be our next brown bag where you bring your own. And that's going to be featuring one of our research fellows, Lucy Smith, who's working on a project, The Atlantic Bite, Circulation Economy, and the Meaning of Teeth in George Washington's World. And she used to be here on the staff at Mount Vernon, so her perspective is going to be really interesting to hear. That's on July the 1st. But now on to today's talk. Dr. Alexandra Montgomery, Alla, to those who know her well, and many of you I know her well, so they can all probably call you Alla if they want. Okay. She's the manager of the Center for Digital History at the Presidential Library. She's also kind of the lead program manager of one of our most innovative and intense digital projects called ARGO, American Revolutionary Geographies Online. And this is kind of born out of this project, these map chats. This is an attempt, ARGO is an attempt to digitize all of the maps from the age of the Atlantic revolutions that relate to the American Revolution in particular, and create a unified repository where teachers, students, and scholars can go and find all of the maps that relate to this era to better understand the American Revolution, the experience of it, the tactics that went into it, the strategies, and the stories that surround it. And how many maps have been done so far?
Over 3,000, and we will hit 4,000 very, very soon. There are about 3,500 or so.
So it's a remarkable effort, 4,000 maps in one unified repository from archives all around the world. France, we just got Denmark.
Yes, Denmark will be joining Europe very soon.
Yeah. Canada and the United States. So today she's going to talk about one of those maps, one of the maps that is in ARGO. It's a fascinating map. It came to us from the Richard H. Brown collection. It's John Montroseur's map of New York City. It was drafted, I won't steal too much of your thunder, but it was drafted in the 1760s. The version we have was published in 1775, and it's an interesting story it tells, having been drafted in an earlier period and then published in a later one. And I'm also happy to announce that this map has a complementary map that was published also in 1775 of New York. It's a different perspective. And this map was part of our Matching Editions project. And I want to thank Amelie Kegel for helping us acquire this map. We here at the Presidential Library are trying to rebuild George Washington's library. And he owned, how many maps did he own?
47 flat maps and then a number of atlases,
Yeah.
which contained up to 93 maps.
Yeah.
So a significant map collection.
So he had a significant map collection that we're trying to rebuild, and this acquisition was one of our steps towards that goal. So I'll have you talk about this map today, and in the fall, you said you're going to talk about that map, right?
Soon I will be talking about that.
Maybe even sooner. And after today, I also want to invite everybody to be able to see the Montrésor map in person. We've pulled it out in the reading room.
I believe it's in the overflow.
Oh, in the overflow room. Great. So right out here, you all will be able to see this map in person that she's talked about. Alla?
Thank you so much, Patrick, and welcome, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming. This is the second of my ARGO Map Talk series this year, and I did 3 the previous year, and we have 2 scheduled. I think the scheduling for the second Montrésor map will be pending conservation efforts. So thank you so much to Amelie Kegel for providing the support for that. It's a really fantastic map, and I look forward to telling you all more about it. It will have a cameo appearance in this talk. But I'll hold back some of the more pertinent details for the one that. All right, so is Dr. Sparrow in association with the ARGO Maps project that we've been working on. A partnership with the Norman Leventhal Map and Education Center up in Boston as part of the Boston Public Library. And ARGO, which stands for American Revolutionary Geographies Online, is a project that's spearheaded by us in the Leventhal Center that is meant to become your one-stop map shopping portal for all of your 18th century map needs, which is my usual sales pitch. The idea is that we are bringing together maps of North America on a number of scales. So everything from small maps of singular forts to maps of all of North America, sometimes even the world, that were created between 1740 and 1800, a time period which spans roughly the life of George Washington as well, which we here at Mount Vernon, of course, are heavily invested in. As Dr. Spira mentioned, we have participating member institutions from all over the world, more every day. It's a very exciting project, so I encourage all of you to check it out. It's at argomaps.org. And so for those of you who are joining this talk online, that is where you can look at the maps that I'm discussing today. argomaps.org. For those of you who are here in person, as Dr. Spira mentioned, we have pulled the map. We have pulled the Montrésor plan of New York City. I'll remind you where it is at the end of the talk, but basically you will go down the hall, you'll see an open door right on the right, and you can go in there and take a look at it, which is very exciting. All right. So that's the ARGO pitch. So please go to argomaps.org. It's a fantastic project we've been working really hard on, and that is the reason for these talks that I have been giving. But first, I want to do a little bit of an overview of why maps. Why does Mount Vernon even care about maps at all? Our project is to go deeper into the world of George Washington, the life and legacy of George Washington. And the short answer as to why do maps matter at Mount Vernon is that George Washington himself was a map guy. He was trained as a surveyor. His first job, if you like, was as a professional surveyor when he was very young and is still in his teens. He went on his first surveying expeditions out towards the west, so Western Virginia, towards West Virginia, modern West Virginia. So this here is an image of one of his surveys from that period, which is held here at the library. But even though his career as a professional surveyor was relatively short, he ceased being a professional surveyor in 1751, he continued to use those skills in map making for the rest of his life. So the last map that Washington made that we know of was made just a few months before his death. So he continued to use those surveying skills to execute maps of Mount Vernon, of his farms, of his other lands, and also to turn a particularly critical eye to the maps of others. Because, of course, he didn't only have maps that he made, he also actively collected maps that were useful to him that were made by others. So this here is an example from the Washington Financial Ledgers, where you can see he's acquiring the 1770 John Henry map, of Virginia. And so, as was mentioned previously, at his death, in his probate inventory, you can see this is not all of it. This is obviously not the original probate inventory, right? Because the giveaway is that it's TypeScript. But this is a later TypeScript version of it, where this is just a sampling of some of the maps that Washington owned at his death in 1799. This is a very significant collection of maps for anybody, certainly in that era. And you can see that that's made up of both flat, loose maps, as well as bound atlases. So the map that we're talking about today, I want to do a little bit of explaining about where this map comes into Washington's life. This lecture is going to be a little bit lighter on Washington than some of the other ones are, but I would be remiss if I did not get the good Washington stuff out up front. All of the maps that I talk about in this series are maps that were owned by Washington, would have been known by Washington, would have been studied by Washington. So this particular map comes to us in what's now known as the Yale Atlas. It's a little bit unclear how exactly that atlas is represented in the probate inventory. For my money, I think it's this one. I think it's Atlas of North America. Others will say that it's there's another entry in here that's called Military Plans of North America. But either way, what it is a bound atlas of 43 maps in roughly sort of geographical order, so starting in the north and then heading south, of North America that were all the most recent, most reliable, best maps circa early 1776. So this is an atlas that was put together by Washington at the beginning of the American Revolution. I think that there's fair evidence that it traveled with him, and this kind of became a reference collection for him during the war. So our map that we're discussing today shows up here. It is the Plan of New York. So our copy, to be clear, that we have of it, that you'll be able to see either online or in person, if you're with us in person, is not this one, unfortunately, although this one does exist. It is at Yale University Libraries. I'm not going to say you can go see it. That's up to the librarians at Yale, but it exists. We know where it is, which is rare for Washington's maps. But the version that we have is what Dr. Sparrow referred to as a matching edition. And as he mentioned, one of the goals of the library is to recreate Washington's library so that when researchers and others come, they can see the materials that Washington himself had available, that we can see a recreation of that intellectual corpus that was there for him as he was making plans, and in this case, as he was pursuing strategy during the American Revolution. And you'll also see on this, if you see right above this, I'll try to use a little, there we go. You see right above this, you can see there's also New York North part and New York South part. That is the other Montrésor map that was mentioned. So the other Montrésor map that we recently acquired is also in this Yale Atlas. So this is just, this is a entry from Washington's financial papers, which is generally accepted to show the binding of the Yale Atlas, and which is what allows us to date it to this early 1776 moment. So this is from June 4th, 1776. He is having a bookseller from Philadelphia named John Sparhawk bind together these maps. All right. So that's some of the Washington context. So this is a map that comes into Washington's life as it did the lives of most people, as we will see, in the American Revolutionary period. However, the map itself, the story that it is telling, belongs to a slightly earlier period. You may have noticed in the title for this talk, I referred to this as the Montrésor map of 1766/1775. And the reason for that is because Montrésor created and surveyed this map during a very particular moment in New York and American history. This is a map that really has a story to tell us about the imperial crisis, right? Does anyone want to shout out, tell me what is the imperial crisis? When I say that word, what does that mean, or phrase? There will be an exam at the end of this talk. All right, that's fine. The imperial crisis, right? It's the 1760s. We are coming off the heels of the 7 Years' War, which was a major victory for the British over the French. The British are now have claims to more or less all of North America, or Eastern North America anyway. And it's this moment of triumph, but not all is well. Not all is good in the relationship between the British colonists and the British metropole in London. In an attempt to pay for this very expensive war, the British enact a series of increasingly punishing legislations. This is the era of the Stamp Act. It's the era of the Tea Act. It's the era of the taxes on sugar, taxes on all kinds of different things, which creates a protest movement in the colonies that in some ways presages the American Revolution, which breaks out, of course, in 1775. And this map in particular is a Stamp Act story. So let's back up a little bit. I want to do a slight recap of previous talks that I've done, walk us through, and then bring us back up to this moment. So we're kind of doing a record scratch. You're probably wondering how I got here, kind of a moment with this map. So let's back up. Which is this 7 Years' War moment. So I already discussed the 7 Years' War, right? So this is a map of the geopolitical situation prior to the 7 Years' War. I didn't include the after, but basically if you're thinking about, okay, what does North America look like geopolitically after the 7 Years' War? It's this, but you just take a paint bucket and you move the red everywhere, right? So this is a moment where it goes from being heavily contested between all of these big European imperial powers to having the British at least having a claim to. It's worth noting that most of this land is in fact occupied and practically controlled by indigenous peoples, but the British are the European power that have a claim to this entire area. So the previous set of maps that I discussed were really related to that earlier period. They were interested in things like mapping the interior. They were interested in things like looking at the areas. So if we go back for a minute, looking at these hashed areas where both the French and the British are making rival claims. And these are the areas where the war really breaks out. And this is where we have a really big Washington story about how he's there in those areas. He is, according to some, responsible in some ways for the outbreak of this war. And that's really reflected in the maps that we talked about before. So we talked about the Fry-Jefferson map, which tells a story about the western development of the colony of Virginia. We talked about the Evans map, which is really our first detailed look at this interior Ohio country. And we talked about the Mitchell map, which I've liked to talk about as the sort of Google base map of the 18th century. This is the best map of North America when it's made in 1755 and remains relevant through the end of the American Revolution. This is the map that gets used in negotiations, deliberations at the end of the American Revolution when they're determining where the new border is going to be between the new United States and the colonies that remain loyal to Britain. In our last talk, last month, I talked about the Hutchins map, which is another map of the West. And in that, I brought up this idea of the 1760s as a great era of surveying, where a lot of the maps that are getting made during this time are getting made because the British, in this newly expanded moment where they have eliminated their European rivals, are going, okay, well, now what we're going to do is we're going to go out there and we're going to survey all of it. We're going to make great new maps. We're going to make great new maps of the interior. We're going to make great new maps of the South, and we're going to make great new maps of the North. However, there is another set of mapping stories about the 1760s, and that's what today's talk is about, which is, of course, the imperial crisis. The imperial crisis, this moment of tension, this moment of riot, this moment of tax revolt between the colonists and the powers that be, the British state, if you will. So this is a great map that is really helpful to illustrate some of this story, which is, these are called the cantonment maps, which basically, there's a series of these. So this is the one from 1776 that show where British troops are deployed in North America. And as you can see here, I think it's actually a little bit more striking if you do this. We have the 1765 map on the left and the 1766 map on the right. I'm going to do another class participation thing here. Can anyone tell me what are big differences here? What's happened in these years? More troops? More troops where? More troops specifically in New York, yeah? Like, look at this. Before, there's a couple. There's not no troops in New York in 1765, right? But 1766, okay, something's happened here. Something's gone on. And what we see in these two maps is a shift, right, in troops, in military interest from this interior that was the focus of the 7 Years' War, that was the focus of a lot of these surveying efforts. All of a sudden, they're moving into these urban areas on the coast. And that is a direct reflection of the unrest that has been created during these years. So I show you this especially because it is New York. We often think about Boston when we're thinking about Stamp Act riots. You know, we're thinking about people being tarred and feathered. We're thinking about Liberty trees. And this is not to denigrate any of the great upheaval that was in Boston. But there's a New York story here that the Montrésor map is directly reflecting that is every bit as dramatic. Because I don't think... Yeah, Boston isn't even on this map, right? This is all about New York. This is all about moving troops into New York. So now we're back here, right? So I said before, 1775, but actually it's 1776. Same year as that second cantonment map that shows this vastly increased amount of troops in New York. So what has happened here is that this map, as we're going to see shortly, is made specifically in response to the unrest in New York. This is a map that is surveyed, that is created as a tool, as a new set of tools for the British administrators in New York City to better attempt to control the situation of the Stamp Act in New York. So who's John Montrésor? Who is the person that creates this map? First of all, he's a guy that has a really great portrait. Honestly, this is one of my favorites. This is a John Singleton Copley portrait of John Montrésor, circa 1771, so a couple years after the moment that we're talking about. John Montrésor is a military engineer. That means that he is responsible for creating plans, both for fortifications and for other things, but also for surveying and creating maps. This is a highly trained profession. This is a highly skilled profession. All of our finest maps from this era come from folks that have a background like John Montrésor's, and many of our finest maps come specifically from John Montrésor. He was a tremendously skilled surveyor. And he came from a family of military engineers. He was actually born in Gibraltar. So he really has like kind of an imperial biography, right? He's born in Gibraltar to a father who's a military engineer. He's educated in England. And then he comes to North America with his father during the 7 Years' War and begins working his way up the military ranks. He married an American woman, well, her father is from Bermuda, who also has a really good portrait. I'm going to be honest with you. Part of the reason why I put these in here is just so we can just like take a second and be like, man, they look great. I'm a little jealous. She is in a military uniform. Well, a military-inspired uniform, right? So it's just Francis Tucker Montrésor. You know, they married. They had a number of children with names like Thomas Gage Montrésor. But unfortunately for Francis, John Montrésor did have a bit of a reputation as not being a one-lady kind of man, despite how good his wife looks in that military uniform. So this is the cover page of a very popular book called Charlotte Temple, which came out in the 1790s. It is a novel of the sort that you may be familiar with if you've read any 18th century novels, or if you've watched, or if you're even familiar with works of Jane Austen, Dipped Your Toes in the World of Bridgerton. This is a story about a rake. This is a story about a wretched man who seduces an innocent English schoolgirl, brings her across the ocean to America, and then abandons her. What a monster. Who could possibly do a thing like this? Maybe John Montrésor. It is widely thought and fairly credible that the character of John Montreville, I know, right, is directly inspired by John Montrésor, and certainly we know that he had at least one or two illegitimate children that we're pretty well sure of, and mistresses. He is also popularly rumored to be the father of Ethan Allen's first wife, also a Francis, awkwardly. So he, you know, let's just say that John Montrésor was a character. He was a fabulous, incredibly skilled surveyor, but not necessarily the kind of person that you would be thrilled to have around any of your children. All right. And as I mentioned, this is far from the only map that John Montrésor made. He is one of the most skilled surveyors of his era. So this is the map that was mentioned at the beginning that was acquired for us recently as part of our Matching Editions Maps project. It's a map of the province of New York with part of Pennsylvania and New England. Also comes out in 1775. Also is part of Washington's Yale Atlas and would have been used by him when thinking through and planning the New York campaign during the American Revolution. Just wanted to put that there. It's currently undergoing conservation here, so we're not able to bring it out yet, but Stay tuned. Stay tuned for more on this map. We're just going to skip past that. Okay, so now we are back up to the 1760s. So John Montrésor stayed in North America after the conclusion of the 17 years, only 7 years war. He works under Thomas Gage, who is the commander of the British forces in North America. Montrésor is in many, many different places during this time, basically anywhere where interesting military activity is happening, he is there. By the time of the imperial crisis, he is in New York City with Gage. So the Stamp Act, of course, this is the part where we're going to have an exam at the end. The Stamp Act is one of these legislations that's put through by British Parliament in an attempt to recoup some of the massive losses during the 7 Years' War and the immediate aftermath. It has some of the best iconography of this period. I am a longtime super fan of this great little skull and crossbones guy here, as well as you can see on the right there an example of a No Stamp Act teapot. These were made in England for the American market as a show of, your political positions around the Stamp Act. The way the Stamp Act worked, and Stamp Acts were a very old thing in England, and there are still Stamp Acts to this day, is that when you were purchasing or using a particular type of paper good, so newspapers, playing cards, deeds of sale, you would need to affix a stamp to that paper to show that you had paid the stamp duty. So it's a tax on certain types of transactions. It's meant to kind of like live in the background as a way for the government to collect money as you're performing other normal transactions, right? And the American colonists are absolutely outraged by the Stamp Act. I'm not going to belabor this too much, but this is a moment where basically anybody that has stamps or has said that they are going to be a stamp master or be someone who is distributing these stamps, it becomes a target. They have a target on their back. My two favorite stories about the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act is meant to come into effect on November 1st, 1765. In Nova Scotia at this time, there has been a major land boom. A number of Philadelphia gentlemen, including Benjamin Franklin, are very involved in the land trade there. And you get this moment where there is a massive crush of all these people trying to close the deals up on October 31st, because the next day, all of a sudden it's going to cost a bunch more because all of their deeds are going to need a stamp. So something like 2 million acres of Nova Scotian land is deeded away specifically on October 31st. My second favorite story, which also involves Nova Scotia, is that Nova Scotia, unlike basically every other mainland colony, does use the stamps. And a stamped Nova Scotian newspaper appears in New York during this period. And it is described by a scandalized New Yorker as the most tragical tragedy that has ever been tragedized in the history of man. Emotions are high. Stamps may seem like nothing, but they are in fact everything, and especially so in New York. In New York, right as the stamps are supposed to be being enforced, a ship full of stamps and stamped paper arrives in New York Harbor in October. Again, this is going to go into effect on November 1st, and you start seeing these placards get put up around town. So these are all handwritten placards. These are posted in various places, and they read, Pro Patria, the first man that either distributes or makes use of stamp paper, let him take care of his house, person, and effects. Vox Populi. Is this threatening? It's threatening enough, right? It's threatening enough where if you see this on the street, you're gonna watch your business. This one is in the collections at the British National Archives in Kew. So this is one where someone who is loyal to the British Crown saw this, sent it back, and is now docketed in part of the state papers there. Another one of these came up for auction just earlier this year, which was incredibly cool to see. And you can see it looks like it's the same hand. It's basically the same line. It does have this great "We Dare" line there, which does make everything more threatening. But you can see this is a campaign that's going around New York to make it clear in no uncertain terms that stamps and stamp paper are not going to be used in the city of New York. We are not going to tolerate the use of these stamps. This is not Halifax, Nova Scotia with their tragical newspapers. This is New York. And indeed, when the stamp paper appears, a group of Sons of Liberty members storm Fort George, where the stamp paper is being kept. The governor is forced to flee in a ship and hang out in the harbor for a while to try to avoid any personal bodily harm. His carriage is burned in front of his house. This is a great image here also from Kew, kind of showing a view from the ship of the action during these stamp riots in this moment. So this is November 1st when the Stamp Act was meant to take place. And things apparently continue to be extremely tense. Situations are variously described as, lawless or gang rule, up until the Stamp Act is then repealed. So this is a situation in which the British imperial apparatus of New York is feeling really under siege, really under threat by these anti-Stamp Act rioters. And in the midst of all of this, this is the context in which our Montrésor map of New York City is made. To give you some context about why we needed this map, this was at the time of the Stamp Act riots, this was the best and only map of the city of New York. It kind of, here's a closer look. I like this map. It's really fun to look at, but it does kind of give me the energy of like a placemat at a tourist restaurant. You look at this and you imagine like this is not necessarily the kind of detail or information that you need if you are Thomas Gage, right? If you are the commander of the military forces who is facing a situation where the people you are there to govern are revolting against you and rioting in the streets. This is not necessarily the kinds of helpful map information that you might want, right? Especially because New York at the time is really incredibly small. I'll show you later a geo-referenced image of the map we're talking about against a modern map of New York. This is New York in the 1760s and 1770s is tiny. It's basically just the area around Bowling Green up to Trinity Church, and then it's farmland, right? So you don't even really need a street map. If you've been there for more than a couple of days, you've kind of figured it out already. So what Gage needs is a detailed military map that shows both the city as well as the surrounding area in a level of detail that is useful for thinking about defense and thinking about military operations. And that's exactly what he asks John Montrésor to do. So Gage goes to Montrésor, his best surveyor, and this is a passage from Montresor's journals. He kept great journals where later on he does things like write down like numbered lists of all the things the British did wrong during the American Revolution, which is very funny to me. But here he says, the commander-in-chief requested a plan of this place on a large scale with its environs and adjacent country, together with the harbor, but particularly to show the ground to the north and northeast of the town, etc. Which makes sense, again, when you remember that this is the previously available map, which doesn't have any of that, doesn't have any of the surrounding area. We also get the sense that things are still very tense on the ground and that this is not a project that is being thought of kindly by the residents of New York, right? This is not something that Montrésor can go and do in the open. So he even says in his journal in January of 1766 that he continued his survey sub rosa, as observation might endanger one's house and effects, if not one's life. So even this project of doing this survey of this area, executing a map of this area, is understood by the more radical residents of the city of New York to be something that is directly in contravention of their interests. It's something that's being done to control them and stop them from achieving their political aims. So this is the original manuscript. So this is surveyed in the late 1765 into early 1766. Sort of midway through 1766, Montrésor returns to England. This is a very low resolution image of the original manuscript, which is held in Thomas Gage's ancestral home in Furl Place. So it's in a private collection. But you can see, as I'll click through these images, that the version of this that gets published is really basically identical to what is put down in manuscript form. So this is the manuscript. This is a test version that Montrésor has published in 1767. Well, not published, it's struck in 1767 as a test version. But for whatever reason, he chooses not to take it to wide circulation. And then this is the version that is finally widely published in 1775. So if we back up again, it's the same right down to the style of the little directional compass rose, right? So this is an image of the one we have here in the Mount Vernon Ladies Association collection, which again is part of the Richard H. Brown Revolutionary Maps collection. Richard Brown's collection is our single largest map collection, and I should also mention that this talk is indebted to one that he and I gave at a November 2022 symposium. So thank you, Richard. He does know that I'm doing this, so I'm not plagiarizing his work. But you can see that this is directly more or less what Montrésor would have put to paper in this moment of 1766. One of the reasons that I wanted to clarify the 1766 versus 1765 distinction is that pretty much the only thing that has changed in this map from the manuscript original is that the publisher has gone in and changed originally. So if you see in this line here, it's a plan of the city of New York and its environs to Greenwich on the north or Hudson's River and to Crown Point on the east, the Sound River, surveyed in the winter 1775. So what the publisher has done is just struck out 1766 and replaced it with 1775 to make it seem newer than it was, which is a classic publishing tactic, right? You know, we have not changed that much as a species, but it is in fact completely inaccurate. This was not surveyed in the winter of 1775. It's surveyed in the winter of 1765-66. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about how this map becomes influential. Then I'm going to show some details from the map, and then we're going to wrap things up with hopefully ample time for questions. So the Montrésor map essentially forms the basis of the future of mapping in New York City. This is not as obvious if you sort of line the maps up by published date, because there is this long gap between Montrésor's surveys and the publication of the map. But if you look at who is doing the work, it becomes very, very clear. So the next, probably overall, the most influential map of New York City of this era is what's called the Ratson, which is another spelling error plan of New York. And the Mount Vernon Ladies Association version of this map, which is again from the Richard Brown collection, is currently on display in the museum. So if you are on site and you're planning on going over to the estate today, if you take a few moments in the museum, you can see this map on display as well. And this map, essentially, Bernard Ratzer was also a surveyor. He worked with John Montrésor. And the basis for this map is essentially Montresor's notes, plus then Ratzer being able to take advantage of the more settled environment of New York City after the Stamp Act riots to do a little bit more detailed surveying. So when you put these two things side by side, you can see that especially in the area around the dockyards, the Ratzer map is more accurate, but it's built on that foundation of the Montrésor map. This map then in turn became the basis for this map, which is one of the most visually striking maps of New York during this area. It includes the surroundings in a much greater amount of detail or at all. So you can see the rolling farmland that Brooklyn used to be around it. But again, this is all indebted to the original work of John Montrésor. And this Ratzer plan I didn't put it in here, I should have. If you overlay later maps of New York City through the early 19th century, you can tell they've literally just taken the outline of this map and then just added in whatever new streets there are. So this really becomes the foundational base map for future maps of the city of New York. All right, let's look at a couple of details. The first thing I just want to show you is this is a very quick and dirty geo-referencing job on my part. One of the features on ARGO maps is we have the ability for you, the users, to geo-reference a map. And what that means is by defining a series of points, we can then overlay historical maps onto modern maps. So we can get a better sense of scale, change over time, as well as accurateness of maps. So this I'm not going to say is the best geo-referencing job anyone's ever done. But I wanted to do this both to give you a sense of, well, one, just the change over time in New York. You can see the amount of infill that's happened in Lower Manhattan, but also how small the New York City of these stories is. The New York city of the 1760s, 1770s, the New York City that George Washington would have known is a tiny little postage stamp compared to what we now think of as this massive, overstimulating, loud, I like New York, but I'm happy I don't live there, always open, city that never sleeps. It's not that yet, right? It's a very small city where everyone's living on top of each other and all of these things are happening at the same time. And then I like to do this with the map. I like to take some time to look at the details. One of the things that this map shows is it's the moment where Greenwich actually isn't even a village yet. This is not only a situation where Greenwich is vastly separate from the rest of the city, but there's barely anything there. There are some estates. It's labeled as Greenwich. It is a separate area, but it's essentially a series of large estates and not much else. One detail that the Montrésor map shows that other later maps will not As you can see, there is an obelisk there, and it's an obelisk which is dedicated to the memory of General Wolfe and others. So this is a reference to, of course, the great hero of the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, General James Wolfe, who was the British commander against the French, who struck essentially what is generally assumed to be the final blow of the 7 Years' War. Right, this is the moment where the city of Quebec falls, and the British emerge triumphant, and everything else sort of falls like dominoes after that point. So this is a monument that was in 1759. That battle. So this was done in 1766. So they got this obelisk up very, very quickly, which I personally find impressive. You know, America, we get things done. But also it's a reminder of a moment where the colonies were much more part of this larger imperial universe. This is an obelisk to a British hero. He was the most celebrated and most memorialized hero of the time. A great number of monuments to Wolfe went up on both sides of the Atlantic. And so this is a time when New York City is still very much part of those things. We have the Stamp Act riots happening, but in no sense is New York separate from this British imperial context. There's still a colony. They're still very much in and of that world. The obelisk was pulled down at some point during the American Revolution, but it's a little bit unclear when. Also, I always just love city maps because you get all kinds of fun details. There's two things in here to draw your attention to. The first is the original Jewish burying ground of New York City. Colonial cities, it's easy to miss or to forget the fact of religious and other diversity that was there from the beginning. So there was a Jewish congregation already in New York at this time. My understanding is that there's now still a marker recognizing this burying ground. Also, this great little note about this like horrible land here that they just can't do anything with. Which I just like those notes where it's like, we keep like putting stuff in here, but it keeps filling back up again. What are we supposed to do with any of this? We have not reached the heights of infill ability that we later got to. And then finally, this is just a crop of the area that was most densely important, an area which, you know, if you go to New York today, you have Battery Park and you think of it as being sort of not that central and not that important necessarily, except from a tourist perspective. But that really was New York at the time, right? So you have Bowling Green, the area marked P is Trinity Church, A is Fort George, which is where the stamped paper was that was overrun by the protesters. And then the governor's mansion is also in and around here somewhere. So we're talking about all of this stuff happening within a 3 or 4 or 5 block radius. And again, just want to really hammer home the smallness of this place. New York is even smaller than Philadelphia is at this time. I haven't put it against Boston, but I feel like it's a little bit smaller than Boston at this time even too, although I'm happy to be wrong there. It's just a very much smaller field of activity than we think about when we think about especially New York today. Okay, and that brings me to the end of my talk. So just to look forward a little bit, obviously today was the Montrésor map. Right now, the next two are a little bit loosely conceptualized, again, depending on the timeline of conservation for the other Montrésor map. One of these may change so we can make sure that we highlight that map. As I have it up right now, what I'm going to be doing is talking about the great surveys of the North and South that also happened during the 1760s, although again, this is not set in stone yet because we will be doing that other Montrésor map. And like this map, these will be, not this map, like this talk, this will also be hybrid online and in person. But yeah, thank you all so much for coming today.
I think we have
now
time for some questions.
We do have some time for questions.
I've got the microphone, so raise your hand. But you might also want to direct everybody to this map. I was thinking about it the whole time you were talking.
Yeah.
This is a spectacular map, and it relates so much to what you were just talking about.
Absolutely. So the map that Patrick is gesturing to is the Charles Blaskowitz headquarters map. This is a reproduction in the room. We don't have the manuscript is safely in our vault. But what this is on the back wall here is it's a large manuscript map of the same area. It's a large manuscript map of New York that was made during the American Revolution. So this was made at the behest of Henry Clinton to show in as much detail as was available the topography of the parts of New York that were militarily important at that time. So when you look at it, one of the things that's striking is how much it's like an intense contrast between areas where it's just like white and nothing, and then areas where there's so much information it's almost hard to even see what you're looking at. But this is in many ways a successor to the work that Montrésor was doing in the 1760s. This is the 1770s version of it, but in manuscript. So this never gets published. And this is a very, very precious, one-of-a-kind object here at the library.
It's truly remarkable. I mean, this is someone sketching. It's a work of art.
It is a work
you
of
look at
art.
it, you think it's printed, but it's not. It's an engineer who's gone out there and drawn this, and it's almost three-dimensional when you look at it up close. You can imagine that being sprawled out on Clinton's table as he's strategizing around New York City while they occupy it. So,
Absolutely.
if you get a chance, take a peek at that on your way out. Questions?
Thank you. Hi, Alla.
Hi, Maggie.
I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about surveying and like how do they make sure that the surveyors are being honest, and because there is no one out there being like, oh, this is exactly where my property line is, or this is where something is. I've just always been curious about that.
Oh, yeah. Well, there's surveyors and there's surveyors. There were a lot of, so it's a military engineer like John Montrésor would have been on the, if we think about it as sort of a pyramid, right? He's the absolute echelon of ability. And also for John Montrésor, there would be nothing, there is zero incentive for him to be giving wrong information. It would just be damaging to himself ultimately. At the bottom of the heap, we have a lot of people who are doing surveying work, especially in areas that were more towards the frontier or in areas where there was less infrastructure built up, who really had very minimal formal training and whose work was not very good, to not put too fine a point on it. And so there's a broad spectrum of ability, there's a broad spectrum of skill. But certainly with military maps is where you see really the heights of what could be achieved. I think it's kind of striking and a little bit surprising to see, we think it's the 18th century, right? They're using tools that are not that different from what people were using in like the Roman Empire. They're basically using bits of string, sight lines, and algebra. And trigonometry to get these things done. But they produce things that are strikingly accurate when it's in the hands of a skilled individual. So the DeBar maps, which I plan to talk about later this year, part of that Northern survey, they are still, when you georeference those, you're like, oh, that's just what it looks like, right? Even now, even today. So, I mean, the answer to your question is it really, really varies. You have to look individually at who these people are, what these people are, and it ranges everything from like very, very sloppy property surveys to really breathtaking work like the Blaskovitz map, like Montresor's work.
A question back here, and then I see the one in the front.
On your last slide, down at the bottom, is that Water Street? I've always been fascinated by the infill that happened over the 100 years of the bottom of New York. And I was wondering, do you know that's Water Street?
I don't know, and I don't want to misspeak. When we can go to, because it has the list of the street names. A lot of them, they're not written on the map.
Yeah.
They're keyed, but
The church goes, anyway. I'm just curious how much had filled in at that point.
not very much. Yeah.
Dangerous question.
Oh, no.
Where would you place George Washington in that pyramid?
Oh, that is a good question. At risk of not losing my job. No, Washington was a very, very careful and skilled surveyor. One of the things he liked to do, Washington did not write in his books as much as some other founders like a Jefferson or a Franklin, who are just like always scribbling in there with their opinions. When Washington intervenes, it's largely because he thinks someone's gotten something wrong. And usually something very technical wrong. So he had a very keen eye for the level of quality in maps and surveys that he expected, to the extent that he there's a large amount of correspondence with him during the war where he's like, this map is trash, please make me a better map. And that does not necessarily reflect his personal skill, although, because most of the maps that he did that are extant are property surveys. They're not necessarily the full military engineer area surveys that someone like Montrésor or later during the war other folks were doing. But certainly he had an eye for it. He had a very keen eye for it. That would also be expressed in his own work. I can't imagine him as a guy that would accept shortcuts from himself, and certainly did not accept them from others.
I want to go back to the example, which I think is really revealing, where he hand colors in the creek, and as the compass rose, or the
Yeah, that's all the way back in the beginning. You're gonna ask me to go through like all all 49 of my slides. Yeah.
So, to follow up, these are legal documents, right? They can be used in processes for people to adjudicate boundary disputes between properties. So the importance of the quality of the surveyor would be critical.
Absolutely, yeah. So folks that could afford good surveyors, it was very important to make sure that you had folks that you could trust that were producing high quality work. Because yeah, I could very much burn you later in all kinds of ways.
Hi, following up on George Washington again. I'm from Pohick Church, and I'm a docent, and we talk about his surveying the land distance from each of the parishioners' front porch of their plantation to designate why Pohick was moved from Colchester. And you said something in passing. You said that he stopped surveying in the 1750s. I think that's what I heard you say, that he didn't do surveying after that because that was when his brother gave him the plantation. He was busy doing other things. Did he do the Pohick Church survey himself, or do you think, and do you have this map in your possession here? Where is that map, out of curiosity? Because it made such a big difference to our church.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I could not tell you. I have some ideas, but I could not tell you off the top of my head if we have that, if that's one of the maps we have or its current location. I'm happy to look into that. He stopped serving professionally in 1751. So it was no longer the case where surveying was his primary means of support or the way that he would have defined himself if you were like, what is it that you do? But he did not stop surveying. He continued to use those tools. He, had a full set of surveyor's equipment in his possession on his death in 1799. So he continued to actively do surveying work, just not in the way that he did when he was young. I think we have a follow-up, if you don't mind. Yeah.
I guess I just wanted to follow up on this because he actually outmaneuvered George Mason as a result of this survey. And your point about the quality of the survey and this gentleman's point about the pyramid of how good, it seems to me that he almost would had to have done it himself in order to convince the other vestrymen to vote in favor of him, because he only won by one vote to get the church put where it was.
I would not be surprised if he did it himself.
Yeah,
Again,
so-
I'd want to follow up on that, but
Okay,
that feels
thank you.
very
I
George
appreciate-
Washington.
Hi, to start, I'm from New York City, and so to answer that lady's question, where it says Hanover Square there, the next road below is Water Street, the next one where
perfect.
they're
Okay, good.
building out is Front.
Wonderful. I love that.
There you go. Also, a lot of my focus is on the military aspects, like the Blaskowitz Map here, et cetera. And what I'm kind of curious about is, I know you focused mainly on the cartography and the surveying aspect of it. Have you here looked into any of the specifics and identifying? Because I can tell you, I know with Blaskowitz, he was extremely precise. This one's a little rough, but some of his other maps, very much so, as far as military movements, everything else. And when you geo-reference it and three-dimensionally lay it down, it's amazing.
Yeah, no, I mean, I am not a military historian. I deeply respect the work of military historians. It's something that I'm currently attempting to get a little bit better at wrapping my head around. But yeah, so I've not done the work of, one of the things I like to do, especially moving into doing talks where using about maps that I know Washington was using specifically during the Revolution, is trying to think in a bit more detailed way about what that would look like, which is just to say, I'd love to chat.
And I think one of the maps we have is at Lafayette's map maker that is
Yes.
kind of like in the field. I don't know if you want to share that.
Yeah, no. So we do have a number of maps from Michel Capitan de Chesnoy, who was Lafayette's personal map maker during the war. And one of the maps we have is this beautiful manuscript map of the Battle of Monmouth, which is essentially done as a please don't be mad at us, we tried really hard kind of a map, which is, very detailed about, troop movements, about the impact of terrain, and things like that.
One last question.
Hi, sorry, it's not really a question. It's just to say there's lots of questions about surveying, and there is a book which is really worth reading, which I can pass on. It's called Surveying in Early America, The Point of Beginnings. It's done by Dan Patterson and Terry Clinton. And it's a very well illustrated and really good look at the art of surveying. And it talks about George Washington a lot in there. So if anybody would like to get a note of that, then I'm happy to pass it on.
I believe we actually have that book for sale in the gift shop. So if you would like it today, it is that we can make that happen for you. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you all. This was fantastic.
Great. Thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Now, if you all want to see this map in person, it'll be available right outside here to the right. And Ollie, do you need to
Down
get out
to
of
the
here
right.
first?
Oh, no, it's
If you
fine.
were there?
Yeah, I think Carolyn is
Okay.